Right before she died, the very first woman to ever walk this earth gathered all of her children around her bed and told them a secret she had been carrying for almost 1,000 years. And what she said was so different from the story you think you know that it was nearly erased from history completely. And I know that sounds like the opening of a movie or some kind of made-up legend, but here's the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up. This is real. There is an ancient account preserved in the Ethiopian tradition where Eve, the mother of all the living, knows that her death is only days away, and instead of staying silent, she calls her sons and daughters together and says, "Listen to me, all my children, and I will tell you exactly how the enemy deceived us and what really happened in that garden." And the version of events she gives is not the short, clean 3-verse story most of us grew up hearing. It is longer, it is stranger, and it points the finger at someone the common Bible barely even names. So the question that this entire video is going to answer is simple. What did Eve confess on her deathbed? And why would anyone want to bury the words of the only eyewitness who was actually there in Eden? But before we get to her final words, we have to talk about the book that kept those words alive when almost everyone else threw them away. Now, if you've been on this channel before, you already know that Ethiopia is not a normal place. When it comes to scripture, Ethiopia is home to one of the oldest civilizations in the entire world, and it's the only country in Africa that was never fully colonized. And because of that, they were able to hold on to things that other nations lost, burned, or had taken from them. And one of the things they held on to is their Bible. The Ethiopian Bible is not the 66 books that sit on the shelf in most homes today. The Ethiopian Bible has 88 books, and inside those extra books are texts that most of the Christian world has never even heard of, let alone read it. It contains scrolls from the Old Testament, scrolls from the New Testament, and a collection of writings that were quietly pushed out of almost every other Bible on the planet. And one of those writings is the account of Adam and Eve, their life after the garden, the attacks they suffered, and most importantly, the testimony Eve gave right before she died. Now, the Ethiopians have a whole work that deals with this. It's often called the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. And there's a closely related ancient text scholars call the life of Adam and Eve, and the heart of it, the part everyone forgets, is the deathbed scene. But that is a story we are going to fully unpack in a moment, because if I tell you the ending right now, it won't hit the way it's supposed to. So let's slow down for a second, because you might be sitting there asking, how is it even possible that a story this important, the literal confession of the first woman, could just go missing? Well, to understand that, you have to understand what the Ethiopian Bible actually is and how much it has survived. Certain Ethiopian tribes have been connected to the worship of the Most High for thousands of years. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which they call Tewahedo locally, is widely considered one of the oldest organised Christian bodies in the entire world, older than a lot of the institutions people assume came first. There's even an Egyptian traveller, an historian named Cosmas Indicopleustes, who wrote that Ethiopia was already a Christian land when he visited in the middle of the 6th century. He described how its rulers opened their borders to Christian refugees fleeing persecution from empires that wanted the faith wiped out. So while other kingdoms were busy burning believers, Ethiopia was busy protecting them. And that same protective instinct is exactly why their scriptures survived. This is a country that, according to its own holy book, the Kebra Nagas, traces a royal bloodline back to the famous Queen of Sheba and King Solomon and their son Menelik, who they say became the first emperor and brought sacred things back to Ethiopia. And what's wild is that modern researchers, looking at the genetic makeup of Ethiopians, have found traces of ancient mixing with peoples from the direction of Israel and the surrounding regions around 3,000 years ago, which lines up suspiciously well with the time the Queen is said to have made her journey. So this is not some random nation that invented a few stories. This is a people with one of the deepest, unbroken connections to early scripture on earth. And yet, despite all of that, despite every credential you could possibly ask for the writings they preserved, including the testimony of Eve, were thrown out of the Bibles most people read today. And that should bother you a little bit. And this is where I want to plant a flag, because here's the strange part. The account of Eve's death and her final words isn't some fringe thing that only shows up in one dusty corner. Versions of the life of Adam and Eve exist in multiple ancient languages. It was clearly important to a lot of people in the early centuries it was copied and recopied and carried across borders, which is not what happens to a story nobody cares about. You don't spend hundreds of years hand copying a text by candlelight if you think it's worthless, so the fact that it was preserved so carefully and then later quietly dropped from the standard Bible tells you that somewhere along the line a decision was made, and that decision is the thing we have to investigate. Because somebody somewhere decided that the words of the first woman, the one person who could actually testify about what went down in Eden, were not going to make the final cut. And the obvious question is why, and to answer that, honestly, we can't just jump straight to Eve. We have to take a quick history lesson on how the Bible you hold today was actually built, because once you understand that the disappearance of Eve's confession suddenly makes a lot more sense. See the Bible as we know it. Now, was not always one neat sealed book. In the early days, there were many versions of many different writings floating around, and many different ideas about what those writings even meant. The original texts were written in Hebrew and later Greek before being translated into other languages, and one of the most famous early translations was done by a man named Saint Jerome, who translated the scriptures into Latin and put together what became known as the Vulgate. Around the year 400 and for over 1,000 years, the Vulgate was basically the backbone of Western scripture. But here's the thing that most people don't realise in those first few centuries. There were a huge number of books written about Adam, Eve, Moses, the prophets, and especially the life of Jesus. And not all of them were trustworthy. A lot of them were essentially the fan fiction of the ancient world. Somebody would write a dramatic account, attach a famous holy name to it, and release it into the public. And because there was no internet, no printing press, no way to instantly fact-check anything, these stories spread like wildfire. And as we all know by now, fake news always travels faster than the truth. So the early church leaders had a genuine problem on their hands. How do you separate the writings that carry real ancient memory from the ones somebody cooked up last week to push their own agenda? So they started holding meetings, the most famous being the Council of Nicaea in 325 and the First Council of Constantinople in 381. And in these gatherings, the leaders tried to set rules for what would be considered scripture. A writing had to line up with the teaching they considered apostolic. It had to fit with the rest of the accepted books, and it had to be old enough and trusted enough to be taken seriously now on the surface. That sounds reasonable. Nobody wants the holy book to be full of obvious forgeries. But here's the catch. When you give a small group of men the power to decide what stays and what goes, you are also giving them the power to quietly remove things that are completely real but inconvenient. And that's the door that history walked right through. Because the biggest changes were still to come centuries later when the most famous English Bible of all time was assembled. Despite the Vulgate existing for roughly 500 years, there were still all kinds of competing versions and translations floating around Europe. And by the time you get to the early 1600s, this was driving the reigning king absolutely crazy. King James I looked out at a kingdom full of different Bible versions, all saying slightly different things, and he wanted one version that would settle the arguments, unify the people, and let's be honest, also reinforce his own authority. Several clergymen also came to him complaining that some of the translations going around were just plain wrong. So to fix the problem, the king assembled around 47 scholars and split them into 6 groups, and these men worked separately on different sections for about 7 years. They followed strict rules so that no single person could inject too much of their own bias. And when the groups came back together and their independent work lined up the king, and the church approved it, and in 1611 the King James Bible was published, and thanks to the printing press, it became one of the most widespread Bibles in human history. And here's the part that matters for our story. All of these decisions, Jerome's cuts, the council's filters, and the choices baked into the King James line, meant that certain books, certain accounts, and certain testimonies simply did not make it into the Bible. Most people read today. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian Bible sitting far away, protected by language distance, and a fiercely independent church kept holding on to the very writings everyone else let slip, including the deathbed words of Eve. So now that we've had our crash course, let's get to the real question. Why specifically would the account of Eve's confession get pushed out? And the honest answer is that it falls into a category of writings that scholars call pseudepigrapha now. That's a big word, but it just means texts that are attributed to a figure who almost certainly didn't write them personally, And a lot of the writings about Adam and Eve fall into that bucket because obviously Adam and Eve weren't sitting there with a pen documenting their own lives in a language that came thousands of years later. So most other Christian traditions labelled these books non-canonical, meaning they don't get to be treated as official scripture. And look, I understand part of the reasoning there. Genuinely were people in the ancient world writing fake material with bad intentions, and the leaders wanted to protect the core message from being polluted. Let me give you an example that makes this click. Imagine somebody today wrote a book claiming Kobe Bryant was actually a terrible basketball player who could barely dribble. That book would get laughed out of the building instantly because we all know it's false. We have the footage, we have the memories, but now bury that book for 500 years and let some future person dig it up with no context, and suddenly they might read it and think, wow, maybe Kobe really wasn't that great. So to stop lies like that from poisoning the future, the early leaders tried to root them out in their present and on paper. That's not a crazy instinct. But here's where it gets complicated, because that same filter that catches the fakes can also catch the real ones. And this is exactly the trap with the Eve account. Just because a text is labelled pseudepigrapha doesn't automatically mean the memory inside it is false. It means the authorship is uncertain. And there's a massive difference between those two things. The Ethiopians understood this, which is part of why their tradition kept these writings alive. Instead of treating uncertainty about who held the pen as a reason to throw away the story entirely, they preserved it and read it and let it speak. And that brings us to something most people don't even realise. The Ethiopian Bible itself actually has two different canons. There's the broader canon and the narrower canon. And before I lose anyone, let me quickly define what a canon even is. A canon is just the accepted official list of what counts the rule of what's in and what's out. So it's canon for a phone to have one screen, it's canon for a country to have one president, and it should be canon for this channel to have a lot more subscribers than it currently does. But anyway, the broader Ethiopian canon is the famous one with around 81 books, and it includes works like Enoch and Jubilees and a whole stack of writings that contain some of the oldest surviving memories of the earliest humans. And then there's the narrower canon, which trims some things down, and the full reasoning behind certain choices that gets into territory that honestly could start a fight in the comments section. So all I'll say is, go look up the history yourself and draw your own conclusions. But the point is this, even within Ethiopia, there were debates about what to keep, and the writings about Adam and Eve sat right in the middle of all of it, surviving by the thinnest of margins. Which makes what we're about to read all the more incredible, because against every odd it survived. And pseudepigrapha is only the first reason this account got buried. There are actually a few more layers to it, and the second one is almost embarrassingly simple. Its language, the Ethiopian Bible, was written and preserved in an old language called Ge'ez. And for most of history, if you didn't speak Ge'ez, you couldn't read it. There were barely any translations floating around for outsiders, so even people who would have desperately wanted to read Eve's testimony simply had no way to access it. The word sat locked behind a language wall in monasteries, on top of mountains and out of sight, really does mean out of mind. So it's not always that someone made a dramatic decision to censor this text. Sometimes a story disappears from the public mind just because nobody on the outside could read the container. It was kept in. And that quiet kind of disappearance is honestly more effective than any ban, because you can't go looking for something you don't even know exists. But the third reason is the one that gets a little spicier. And it's the reason a lot of people get genuinely suspicious. And that reason is politics and power in the earlier centuries of the faith. The people running the most powerful empires were not exactly losing sleep over preserving every spiritual detail. They cared about control. They cared about a unified story that kept their authority intact. And any writing that complicated that story or raised questions they couldn't easily answer was a liability. There are even accounts suggesting that certain leaders ordered scrolls that didn't fit the approved narrative to be destroyed, and yet some of those very scrolls kept resurfacing. Think about the famous discovery of ancient writings hidden away near the Dead Sea, found in the 1940s, writings that had been tucked into jars and sealed in caves like someone was deliberately protecting them from being wiped out. That tells you there were people in the ancient world who refused to let certain texts die, even when the powers above them wanted them gone. And the Ethiopian church played that same role on a national scale. It became the cave, It became the jar, it became the stone that outlasted the fire. So when you stack it all up, pseudepigrapha plus the language, wall plus raw political power, you start to understand how the single most important eyewitness testimony in human history could quietly slip out of the book. Billions of people read and almost nobody would even notice it was missing. And before we walk into that final room, there's something you have to understand about what Eve and Adam went through in the years between Eden and her deathbed. Because the Ethiopian tradition doesn't just skip from the garden straight to the grave. The conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan describes a whole brutal stretch of life after the expulsion, and that title tells you everything. It was a conflict, it was an ongoing war, and the account describes Satan not as some one-time tempter who showed up, made his move and disappeared, but as a relentless enemy who came back again and again, trying to finish what he started outside the garden. Adam and Eve were heartbroken. They had gone from paradise to a harsh, unfamiliar world, and they were vulnerable, and the text described the adversary, exploiting exactly that he tried to push them into despair. He tried to trick them into harming themselves. He interfered with their attempts to worship. And at certain points the account even describes him showing up in disguise, pretending to be something good, something helpful, something bright in order to deceive them. All over again. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that is the same playbook from the garden, just with a different mask. The enemy never stopped wearing costumes. He wore the serpent in Eden, and then he kept changing outfits for the rest of their lives. And Adam and Eve had to slowly learn how to recognize him no matter what form he took. So by the time Eve reaches her deathbed, she's not some naive woman who got fooled one time long ago. She is a battle-scarred survivor who has spent her entire life studying the tactics of the one being who hates her family most, and that is what makes her final testimony so valuable. She's not guessing, she lived it. Okay, so we've earned it. Let's finally walk into the room, because the setup for Eve's confession is just as important as the confession itself, according to the ancient account after the expulsion from Eden. Adam and Eve lived long, hard lives outside the garden, and when Adam finally grew old and sick, and his death approached, the text describes a scene of genuine grief. Eve and one of her sons set out desperately trying to find a way to ease his suffering, even seeking the oil of mercy from paradise itself. But there turned away the time for that. Mercy in that form had not yet come. And Adam dies, and the account describes the heavens themselves, mourning the sun and the moon darkening as the first man is laid to rest. And here's the detail that breaks your heart a little. Eve knows she does not have long left herself. The text says she understood. Her own death was only days away, and in that window, with her husband already gone, and her own end closing in, she makes a decision. She is not going to take the truth to the grave. So she calls every one of her children together, sons, daughters, all of them. And she says the words that this entire video has been building toward. Listen to me, my children, and I will tell you what the enemy did to us and how he deceived us. And this is the moment the only eyewitness speaks. And what she describes is not the tidy version, where a talking snake offers some fruit, and everyone makes a bad lunch decision. Eve goes into detail. She explains that when they were placed in the garden, the space was divided up, that Adam watched over and tended one portion, and she watched over another. And it was while they were apart that the enemy made his move. And here is the first piece of the truth, that the short version leaves out. Eve makes it absolutely clear that the serpent was not the real villain. The serpent was a vessel. The serpent was a costume. The real being, the actual intelligence behind the deception, was the adversary, the one we know as Satan, who according to the account approached the serpent, first found it to be the cleverest of the creatures and used it as a mouthpiece, a mask to get close without setting off alarm bells. The serpent was essentially the puppet, and Satan was the hand inside it, and that single distinction changes the entire flavour of the story, because it means the fall of mankind was not a random accident. With an animal, it was a targeted hit, a planned operation by an enemy who already had a personal reason to want them destroyed. And that personal reason is the second buried truth, and it might be the most important part of the whole thing, because the ancient material connected to this account explains why Satan hated humanity so much in the first place. And the reason is staggering. When the first man was created in the image of the Most High, the story says the angels were called to honour that image, to recognize the value placed on this new creation, and the adversary refused. He looked at humanity, and his pride boiled over, and he said in effect, "Why should I bow to this? Why should I honor something made after me? And seemingly beneath me I existed before he did. He should be honoring me." And out of that refusal, out of that pride, the adversary was cast down and stripped of his place. And from that moment, he carried a burning envy, not just toward the Most High, but specifically toward human beings, because humanity had been given a dignity and a closeness that he had thrown away. So when he slithered into that garden, wearing the serpent like a glove, he was not just casually tempting two people for fun, he was getting his revenge. He was trying to drag down the very creatures whose existence reminded him of everything he had lost. And Eve on her deathbed connects these dots for her children. She essentially tells them the thing that ruined us was not a piece of fruit. It was an enemy fueled by envy who could not stand that we were loved. Now she keeps going. And she describes the mechanics of the deception with a kind of painful honesty that you almost never hear. She explains how the enemy worked on her, how he made the forbidden thing look not just harmless but desirable, how persuasion and flattery were used to lower her guard, and the account describes that there was something poisonous woven into that act, something the texts describe as the root of wickedness, a kind of corrupting desire that entered the moment the boundary was crossed, and the instant she ate, she felt it. She describes realizing she was exposed. She describes the immediate shame, the sudden awareness that something had gone horribly wrong. And then she did the thing that would echo through all of human history. She went to Adam, and she brought him into it too. And he ate, and their eyes were opened, and the world they knew was over. And what's so haunting about hearing it from Eve directly is that she does not dress it up. She does not make excuses for herself. She lays out the whole chain, the enemy, the disguise, the lie, the poison, her own choice and Adam's. And she gives it to her children, not as a fairy tale, but as a warning. A mother's final, desperate attempt to make sure her descendants understand what they're actually up against, because she knows the enemy didn't die in that garden. He is still out there, and her kids, and their kids, and everyone down the line will face the same envious adversary in one disguise or another. And I want you to really notice what kind of mother does this, because it would have been so much easier for Eve to stay quiet. Think about it, she is the woman blamed for everything. She is the one history would point at for thousands of years, and she is lying there at the end of her life with every reason to soften the story, to leave out the embarrassing parts to protect her own name, but she doesn't. She names the enemy, she names her own mistake, she names Adam's part in it, and she hands the whole unflinching truth to her children, like a torch, and tells them, "Carry this, don't let it go out." And that is the detail that turns this from a dusty old text into something that honestly hits you in the chest, because every parent watching this knows that feeling. The desperate need to make sure your kids learn from your worst moments so they don't have to bleed the way you did. Eve is the first human being to ever feel that, and the first to ever act on it. And her solution was not just to talk, it was to make the truth permanent. Which brings us to the single most incredible thing she said. And it's the part almost nobody ever talks about. And now we arrive at the part that, to me, is the most chilling and the most beautiful. And it is the reason this account deserves to be remembered, because Eve does not stop at the confession. She gives her children an instruction, and this instruction is the thing that should give you goosebumps. She tells them to record everything she has just said. She tells them to write the lives of their parents and the truth of what happened down and preserve it. And according to the account, she gives an oddly specific method. She tells them to make tablets out of stone and also tablets out of clay, and to write the testimony on both. And the reason is genius. She essentially says if the Most High ever judges the world by water, the clay tablets will dissolve, but the stone will survive. And if the world is ever judged by fire, the stone will crack and shatter. But the clay will be baked hard and endure either way. She says the truth will make it through, whatever comes. Think about what that means. The first woman on earth, knowing she has only days left, is not worried about herself. She is worried about whether the truth will survive. The catastrophes she somehow senses are coming, and she builds a redundancy system out of stone and clay, so that no flood and no fire can erase what really happened in Eden. And just sit with how advanced that thinking actually is. This is a woman in the absolute earliest chapter of human existence, and yet she understands something most people never grasp, that the truth is fragile, that stories get twisted, that powerful forces can bury what's inconvenient, and that the only way to protect a message is to make it impossible to fully destroy. She didn't trust memory because memory fades. She didn't trust word of mouth because word of mouth gets corrupted. She wanted it physical, permanent, doubled up, and disaster-proof. And when you remember that this entire account is itself sitting inside a Bible that survived invasions and fire and centuries of being ignored, you realise that her instinct was not just poetic, it was prophetic. She predicted exactly the kind of thing that would try to erase her, and she planned around it before it ever happened. She is quite literally trying to send a message across time to us. And when you realise that, you understand why it is so devastating that her account got quietly dropped from most Bibles, because the one thing she begged her children to do, above all else, was make sure this never gets lost, and yet, for most of the world, it almost was. So let's bring it all the way home. What is the truth that Eve told right before her death? The truth is that the story we usually get is the trailer, and the Ethiopian preserved account is closer to the full film. The truth is that the serpent was never the real enemy. It was a disguise worn by an adversary who hated humanity, because we were given the honour. He refused to accept. The truth is that the fall was not a careless mistake over a snack. It was an ambush, motivated by envy and pride. And the truth is that Eve, the first mother, did not want to be remembered as the woman who simply messed up. She wanted to be remembered as the eyewitness who told her children exactly how the enemy operates so that they would never be caught off guard the way she was. And most powerful of all, she wanted that warning carved into stone and pressed into clay so that no disaster in history could ever fully silence it. And here's the strange irony that ties this whole thing together. The very Bible most people read trimmed her testimony out. And yet the Ethiopian Bible, the 88-book collection protected by an ancient church and a language few outsiders could read, held onto it the whole time, which means her tablets of stone and clay, her insurance policy against being forgotten, actually worked. It just took the Ethiopian tradition to be the stone that survived the fire. And that's what gets me every single time. The most attacked, the most overlooked, the most dismissed Bible on earth is the one that kept the first woman's final words alive. Ethiopia survived invasions. It survived attempts at conquest. There's even an account of a fire reaching a monastery where ancient texts were kept, and somehow the writings endured. And Eve's confession, the thing she fought to preserve in her last days, made it across thousands of years, of floods, fires, empires and councils to reach you watching this right now. And maybe that's the real reason this account makes people so uncomfortable. Because if Eve was telling the truth, then the enemy in the garden was never some primitive myth about a snake. He was a real envious adversary, running a real deception. And if that's true, then the warning. The first mother carved into stone and clay was never really about the past. It was about you. So the only thing left to ask is the same thing Eve asked her children all those centuries ago. Now that you know how the enemy actually works, what are you going to do with the truth? And if a story this important could be hidden in plain sight for this long, it really makes you wonder what else got left out of the book. You thought you already knew, but that my friend is a story for another day.